All right, everybody. Welcome to tonight's big program. I'm your host, Matt Yancic. I am the founder and the head game master here at Manufactured Myth and Ledger Domain, and I'm pretty excited to be with Catherynne M. Valente tonight. So, for those of you that do not know who she is, Catherynne is, of course, an author, and she's actually published at least several dozen. And she will. I told her this. She will correct me if I'm wrong. But she's.
You want?
Oh, okay. Here we go. So let's see if I can get through the intro without being corrected. Um, so she's the author of at least several dozen works of fiction. So her first work was published in, I believe, 2004. It was called The Labyrinth. She's also the author of the Orphan's Tales duology, which were In the Night Garden and Cities of Coin and Spice.
Yes.
Phew, so far, so good. Okay, let me see if I can keep going with
It's
this.
a lot. I get
I
confused.
know. Well, you've got a lot on your resume here, and that's why I've got you on the big program. So she's also the author of the Fairyland series, and what kind of caught my attention maybe originally was a work she wrote called the Refrigerator Monologues. And for those of you that maybe don't know, refrigerated or the refrigerator is a term that's used when, unfortunately, women are used more as plot devices to forward the narrative of men's stories in superhero comics. But it also, of course, we all know happens all over the place. But at any rate, so that's what originally brought her to my attention in an interview that she was discussing. Her most recent work, oh, and by the way, Vox, no less than Vox, called it one of the 11 best books of 2017. So her most recent work, though, is The Past is Red, and it was, I believe, it was published just a few weeks ago, and it has been called the Candide of our era, of our mm, era. There's a word in there. I don't mind repeating it, but anyway. So Catherynne, did I get that about right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of other stuff in there, but I've
Yeah.
written 41 books, counting The Past is Read. So, like, there's a lot. Uh, my name is Valenti, I will
Oh,
say.
I'm so sorry.
It's so not you, and you shouldn't feel bad for 1 second. My editors have gotten it wrong.
Oh, really?
It is just every like twice a year I put out a PSA saying it's Valenti.
I
But it's fine.
I
It's
I
or
sincerely
if you hadn't told me
apologize.
to correct you, I wouldn't have even said anything.
Oh
So
no, it's
it's really your fault.
in the interest of doing for those viewers that are tuning in that know me, they know that I'm a teacher and I very much believe in just everybody should be open and honest about, about the truth. Why not? It helps further discussion. So, at any rate, we're very lucky to have her. She's an award winning author. She's been nominated for tons of stuff. All of that, I'm sure, will come up as we go through our discussion. But, Catherynne, thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you for having me.
Good.
I've been working all day and just getting back from visiting my family for the first time in a year and a half. So I'm a little tired, but other than that, pretty good.
Yeah. And so, is that because of COVID, I guess?
Yeah, yeah. And I have a small son, so like they
Right.
hadn't seen him since he was a potato.
Oh,
He no longer a potato, very ambulatory potato.
right.
Uh, I wanted, him to be able to see his family and see my niece and my nephew and my brothers and sister and parents and everything. So
Do I take it then? Were you able to get any writing done with
some,
the newborn or
oh, with the newborn, no.
oh,
I thought I would. I really did. Like, and I remember talking to my agent about it because I thought I would get a lot done when I was pregnant,
hmm,
and then I would have like things in the can to be coming out. I could take a little break,
right,
but actually turns out you need your brain to make a baby too. And I just like
right.
I was wiped out for 9 months, and I had kind of a difficult pregnancy too.
Oh,
And then once he was born, I guess he was born in September, and I started writing again in May. So I took, a little more than 6 months off. Um, and then was kind of back into it, but slow. And only like in the last couple of months am I fully back at my old pace.
Right. So you're getting back to work. So let me ask you then. I guess I usually like to start way back at the beginning. Have you always had a love for writing? I know that, and I may be wrong, but I know that you had mentioned in other interviews that you maybe started with poetry. But have you always been into writing, or have
I
there
did.
been other things that?
There's been other things, but I'm not like if the writing thing stops working out, I'm gonna be in big trouble because I'm not that great at most other
Right.
things. I've loved words and books and writing since I was a little tiny child. Like I've seen video footage of me at like 4 or 5 years old, just
Hmm.
like toddling after my parents and telling them a story about the wizard who lives under the mountain. Like it's always been me. I read very early. And as soon as I could like read on my own, I was off. I was reading adult books far before I should have been. But there really wasn't the same YA middle grade bridge that there is now when I was growing up. It was kind of like you finish the children's section and then you're on your own.
Then you
Uh,
read James Michener.
yeah, or Stephen King
Right.
in my
Or Stephen
case.
King. Yes. Yes, that was
uh,
me.
yeah,
Yeah,
yep. So
same
I
thing.
read my first Stephen King when I was 9. Um, which I know I recognize as now the parent of a human child. Like that was wildly inappropriate, but I hid it from my parents. Not like they knew.
Let me ask you about that though. Like, okay, so I'm a teacher,
Hmm.
and as you just mentioned, I too was reading Stephen King at like 9 or 10 because I used to go through my parents had like my parents were voracious readers. They had like boxes of books out in the garage, and when I was bored, I used to walk over into the garage, dig through it. I would find a book, and like those scary covers, attracted me. And I read them like crazy, and I read all of them, and I think I turned out okay. Do you think they're inappropriate for a 9 or 10 year old?
Um. So, I mean, I definitely pulled, and I know that the first one I read was Salem's Lot, and I pulled it out of a box in the garage, and I was cleaning the garage, and I didn't find it too scary at 9.
Mm-hmm.
However, I was already like this massive fairy tale freak, and fairy tales are way grosser than a lot of the stuff Stephen King writes, actually.
Yeah.
And so I do think I turned out okay, and I'm not sorry for having read any of that stuff. I will say that it's kind of undeniable that almost all of Stephen King's books have things way above a 9-year old's understanding, but kids are quite good at sort of skipping over the parts they don't understand and
Yeah.
stitching together something they like from what's left over. So you know would I, if my son was 9, would I let him read Stephen King? Yeah, if we had a conversation about it first, I totally would.
Right.
And then we talked about it during, and then we talked about it after. But like I feel like, I don't know exactly how old you are, but I feel like we're probably of a similar age.
We're
And
about the same generation.
like we hid a lot of things from our parents.
Yeah.
Like I didn't go, oh, I'm reading this cool new vampire book. Like I knew I wasn't supposed to be reading that. I hid it. So I mean, I do think that undeniably some of it's inappropriate, but I also was just that there was no way you were keeping it away from me.
Right.
So
Why do you think it was that you were so why were you so attracted to stories then? Like, what was it like while other kids were out maybe, I don't know, riding bikes or they were climbing whatever or they're, I don't know, messing around with cars? I was off reading a book. I kind of know why, but I wonder why you think you were reading books.
never been asked that question. I mean, I think some of it was wanting to escape. I didn't have a lot of friends, and I had kind of a complicated childhood. So there's definitely an escapist quality. Like, books are friends.
Hmm.
They are not going to refuse to hang out with you. They're not going to yell at you. They're not going to reject you. They'll always be there as soon as you're ready to come back to them. Um, but I just also think that I had such an imagination from the time I was little. Like I lived in my head early on, and like finally being able to read well enough to find books that felt like the inside of my head. Like it was like a drug. And I know the first one I read too, because I remember this so clearly, and my dad has told the same story, so I know it really happened.
Yeah.
Uh, the first book I read all myself. Nobody helped me.
Yeah.
Nobody read any of it out loud to me, and it was a real grown-up book. Like it wasn't,
Hmm.
a picture book or a board book or a chapter book or anything like that. It was the Neverending Story.
Really,
Uh,
that's
yeah,
interesting to me.
yeah. Well, I was 5,
That's
and
very interesting to me.
nobody believed I read it. Like I came downstairs and said I'd finished the book, and like my parents had friends over, and nobody believed this tiny 5-year-old had. It's a long book,
Yeah.
like it's not never ending, but it's quite long.
Yeah.
And like I had to, they basically like flipped through it and quizzed me to prove it, and I absolutely had read it cover to cover. But I mean, even just that book. My son's name is Bastion.
I
No joke.
noticed that from reading through your Twitter feed, and I remember I thought, oh, I need to ask her about
I
that, and
still
then
love
I
that book
immediately
so much.
forgot about it. But that does
But
make
that book
sense.
is about being a kid that nobody notices, and finding a world inside you, and that's all I was looking for, really.
Were you
Was
aware? This is so I have to confess something.
Mhm.
Whenever I tell people I love reading, whenever I tell people like I am an English teacher, whenever I tell them this stuff, there are certain books that they expect me to have read, and sometimes the Neverending Story comes up. I have to be
Huh.
honest, I've always had trouble getting through it, and I think I like to tell myself so I can sleep at night that it has something to do with the translation or whatever because it was like translated
It's
from.
definitely a better edition than all the other editions.
Are there different? How do you know if
Yeah.
there at least a
So
couple of
here's how
different?
you can tell. Crack the book open. Is the ink black or is it red and green? And if it's
Oh,
red and green, it's the good one.
I've always found the black paperback, just the
Yep.
standard issue,
No,
and I've
the
never.
good translation has everything that happens in our world is in burgundy, and everything that happens in Fantasia is in green.
I had. Wow, that's a whole nother dimension to
It's
the book. I had
so
not.
beautiful. I love it so much.
Okay, I'll have to. All right, I will have to give it yet another chance, knowing that published and acclaimed author has recommended it to me. I think that may have a little bit more of an influence on me. Um,
It was a big book in my life, and I think that because it's got this whole because I read it so early and it's got this whole metafictional,
yeah,
metatextual aspect to it. I think that it felt like a like real life, because the whole thing of that book is that there's a kid who finds a book and it's called the same thing as the book that you're reading. And
right,
like I was 5, so I had very little experience like reading anything, but it blew my mind that any book could like connect to the real world in that way,
right.
because I'd come from Narnia. It's not very meta Narnia.
Yeah.
So yeah, yeah.
So then, if you're reading these books at such a young age, are you doing other things that are kind of surprise? And I don't want to get too personal, but I mean, are there other elements to the childhood you that are like surprising people as well, like or beyond
Probably.
age
I
range?
mean, I was a verbally very precocious kid. Like, I mean, my mom says that like I met a girl named Ashley when I was 2, and I said Ashley sounds like actually.
Yeah,
Like
that's a pretty good connection for a
yeah, like
two-year-old.
I talked really early on, and I was really into theater and movies and plays and all of that really early on, as well. And I guess most people don't know I was in a few commercials when I was little. I was an extremely
Oh,
cute
that's
child.
why I'm interviewing you now. I don't really want to talk
For
about the books. I want to
Horizon
talk
Bank,
about those commercials. What
the
commercials were you
local
in?
Seattle bank. But I had the same hair I do now, except that it wasn't, I didn't have as much, so it wasn't too heavy to make it fall out. They were like these big Victorian sausage curls,
Huh.
and like down to my waist. I just was this little doll of a child. So my grandfather ran an advertising agency, and I was in a few of the commercials. Um, like the thing is that I was hopeless at anything physical. Like my siblings are all amazing at physical activities. My sister is an incredible athlete. Went full scholarship for soccer to her university, and I can't play cornhole. I can't do any
Yeah.
of it. Like literally, I'm hopeless at all that.
How much do you think of this? And of course, I know this as a teacher. I do know this. I see students that stand out from other students. How much of this do you think is nature versus nurture, or do you think it's some combination of? Were your parents handing you books left and right? Were they making you go through mental exercises in order to, build your brain muscles, or?
Oh, no, no mental exercises or anything. I mean, I think that, look, I grew up in the 80s. Like it was a whole sort of
Yeah,
different parenting landscape. So like, I was sort of loose with
yeah.
my little brother a lot of the time. And like that loose included the bookshelves. So no, they weren't like I mean, you know, they weren't assigning me books. My parents would occasionally give me a book to read. My mother, and I have a very involved step parent and my bio mother and my dad. So like it gets confusing. But my biological mother was in graduate school for a lot of my childhood. So she would give me like, I remember 5, 6, not too much older than that, if at all, getting The Breasts of Tiresias, which is a surrealist play by Apollinaire from her,
Wow.
being allowed to swear if I swore in French. And like, I was 8 or 9. She had me read all of Waiting for Godot out loud to her, which I
Wow.
think probably was more psychologically damaging than Stephen King.
Maybe.
But yeah, so she was more the like read this and then I would, where it was more, free form and kind of following what I liked. I'll tell you a funny story though. I told my sister-in-law last night, actually, when we were talking about the Da Vinci Code, and because the new show's coming out by Dan Brown, and I said, "Well, so there's a fancy Da Vinci Code for like smart people, called Foucault's Pendulum."
Oh,
And,
yeah, of course. Yeah.
and so this book is very dear to me, but it like in a really weird way. So custody changed when I was 13 and I went to live with my mom instead of my dad. And I was missing my dad. And I remembered seeing that book on his bookshelf. So I was like, okay, I'm going to get that book at the used bookstore. I'm going to read that book and I'll
Mm.
feel closer to my dad.
Yeah.
I was 13 though, and there's like 8 different languages in that book. And it's a lot. It's
Yeah,
just a
it's a lot for
lot.
that age
it,
to, or
it is
for
like
an
the
adult to take in.
metaphor. Yeah, I mean, well, it's like the byword for a difficult book. Like
Yeah.
people use it just to refer to difficult literature. And so I didn't understand it very well at all. So I decided, the way 13-year-olds decide things, that I would read it every year until I understood it. And I did until I was 25. And I got a degree in classics, so I can read the Latin and the Greek and the Hebrew.
Oh,
And
that is actually cool.
I took French in school to
Yeah.
read the French and the Occidental, and
Yeah.
like it's not wasn't all specifically, to directly to read the stuff in Foucault's Pendulum, but it was my guide to my own self education.
Hmm.
If I didn't get a reference, I went and looked it up, and I went down the rabbit hole before Wikipedia existed. In
Right.
the library of finding out all of those things, and I read it every single year until I felt like I understood it, which was about 25.
And this is something that you're kind of obviously you're motivated. You're motivated by
Exactly.
yourself to do that. And you also made mention, and when you said this, it's true. Like I don't actually have any children myself, so I don't know what it's like to raise children. That's why I'm a teacher. I get to give them back at the end of the
Mhm.
day, and I'm like, "Oh, you deal with them now."
Totally valid.
So, I you mentioned that the 80s are kind of that time, and I know this, when you're just the parents kind of let you go do your thing. Do you think maybe that was probably something that allowed you to sort of blossom as yourself or blossom as a reader? Do you think letting giving a child that sort of space is maybe something that will greatly benefit them?
I mean, I think it's six of one, half dozen of the other, because first of all, there were four of us. So, it's not like I was an only child who, otherwise would have gotten infinite attention. There's always a balance when there's a lot of kids in a house. But I think that, and someone who's having to make these choices now, I think that there's a trade-off between just like turning kids loose
Yeah,
of a day,
yeah,
and that gives them a certain amount of freedom, but then also they benefit greatly from you being there with them and on that journey with them and able to show them things and help them. So I think that there's kind of a balance there. And have we gotten off balance a little bit? Yeah, probably. But I understand, the fear of the world we live in and everything. It's part of why I live on a weird little island off the coast of Maine, because here he can run around and be completely safe, and I
Right.
can be pretty assured that like he can't leave.
Yeah.
uh, and he'll come back at the end of the day. So like part of the reason I moved here was, the idea of if I ever did have a child,
Mm.
that they could have, a little of what I had growing up in the 80s, and then have the good parts of growing up in the, Generation Z, Zoomer, whatever they're going to call the kids
Right.
born in 2018 thing, because there's a lot of really good stuff that we didn't get,
Yeah.
you know back then too. Like it's great to self guide, but like not every kid is going to be as motivated as I was to
Yeah.
find all that stuff for
Or
themselves,
as capable.
or as capable of doing
They
stuff.
they
Yeah.
often need that guidance.
It does help to have a parent in graduate school where you literally are watching them learn how to research things,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know?
What? Let me swing things in the other direction then. So at this time, what do you do? How's the writing going at this point? So in your teens and your early 20s, are you writing?
I was writing poetry through my teens, and a
Hmm.
little bit of prose poetry. I wouldn't necessarily call them short stories. They were very stream of consciousnessy. My English teachers never liked them. I had one supportive English teacher my entire
Why
junior high,
didn't they like them? Because they were just too.
because I was supposed to be keeping a journal of like what
Uh-huh.
I do during my day, and instead I was writing like Barthian fiction.
Oh.
you know and Mr.
Yes.
Scrabble, I still remember his name because
Oh
it
my
sounded like
goodness.
Alien,
I'm
Doctor
gonna get
Who.
a cease and desist order from him now.
No, oh, I don't care. Mr. Scrabo, Skrabo. It totally sounds like a Doctor Who
Mm.
alien. He was also the football coach, so he had no time for that whatsoever. For like
Oh.
turning it, I do remember one of them was called The Raven's Bride, and he just rolled his eyes. He had just no time for it at all. Um, so I didn't have a lot. I had one Mr. Crossman who was like my Mr. Keating from Dead Poet Society, a really wonderful teacher that really supported me. And most everyone else didn't really get me or what I what this
Hmm.
weird child who like would hang out with my teachers after class. I was that kid. Uh and what it was I was doing, but they all did know that I was I don't want to say that I was different, but like, you know, I cared a lot about everything in school and most kids didn't.
Yeah.
Um even when I went on to college, like I remember my my Greek teacher saying, I don't remember what I said to her to make her say it, but she said, this is why I never worry if you don't have your homework completely done, because I know you never stop thinking about this.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a strange, the whole pedagogical process is very strange when you end up with a kid who is genuinely passionate about the pedagogical process.
Well, I kind of know what that's like. I've had students like what you've described in the past. I actually like it. I mean, I enjoy it. I mean, I enjoy being able to. There's something that's very warm about being a teacher, but then there's also something that's also a bit lonely about it. And the loneliness comes from the fact that you can never quite really tell them exactly what you're feeling and what's going on or what you think. There's a certain, mentor role that you're always in, and I think a good teacher sort of remains in that role. And then maybe every so often knows when to lower the barrier or whatever. But the idea of having that student where I can have a conversation about these sorts of things is always something that you kind of delight in, and you think to yourself and you sort of fantasize. In 20 years, this student's going to come back, and they're going to be an author, or they're going to be, a director, or they're going to be like an executive that's a great communicator, or and doing the right things with their company, and you fantasize about that. So, from my own perspective.
Yeah.
Um, so
Well,
it's
so Mr. Crossman, who I stayed in touch with over the years, like he wants me to give his eulogy because I am that student for him. So I completely get that, and it's where you come from and the education you come from is such an important part of who you grow up to be. I happened to go to an incredibly good junior high school, public school. I'm public school from K to graduate school.
Mm.
I've never attended a private institution. Um, but I just happened to go to Ralph Waldo Emerson Junior High in Davis, California, which is an extraordinarily good, or at least was at the time, just had amazing teachers who really cared, and programs that ended right after the class after ours.
Oh.
The kids weren't as into poetry as our class, and like vandalized things. But we got to go on a week-long trip to Yosemite. We got to go to the Shakespeare Festival in Ashland, Oregon. Like we got a lot out of our education at that junior high school.
Did
uh,
you have some first attempts at larger works that you're kind of trying as you're going?
yeah, I did. I mean, I remember a couple of novel ideas I had, one of which wasn't even that bad. Um, and but I also just, you know, money was always a problem growing up. So like I
Mhm.
kind of always told myself like you can't really be a writer though. Like you're not gonna make any money, and that's you can't live like that. That's not a thing. And of course there is again complicated growing up in the 80s and 90s because there are female role models for you. There sure are, but you need to know that the initials equal woman rule, and you need to be interested to go look those writers up and find out about them. Otherwise, it just doesn't feel. It didn't feel like um, my voice was going to be listened to
Mhm.
at that point.
So
It was a very different world.
so then what was it? How did you ultimately get your
Yeah.
first thing published? Like what were you publishing
It's
small?
such a weird story. Yeah, no, I did start out publishing small. So uh, I would like to preface all of this by saying I was extraordinarily young. And anyone listening to this, if you are young, you do not have to be as young as I was. It's actually not that fun. Uh, this is all just weird. It's luck. This isn't how it's supposed to work. But if you ask 10 writers how they broke in, they'll have 10 different stories.
Mm.
It was just a time and a place. So I graduated from college, and I was working as a fortune teller in Newport, Rhode Island, and I I heard about this thing called NaNoWriMo, which was
Oh yeah.
only in its second year at the time.
Mm.
So like hardly anybody really heard of it. It wasn't a big thing yet. There were forums and everything, and I was like, well, I'd like to point out I was 22.
Mhm.
Um, I was like, well, I don't want to wait till November, and 30 days is for wimps. I'm going to do it in 10. Again, this is just insane. This is insanity. This is the insanity
What a
that a 20
whippersnapper you are.
a 22-year-old who doesn't know they
Right.
can't do things yet.
But that's how you
Uh,
do it.
but that's yeah. So I wrote a book in 10 days. I did. I wrote between tarot readings, and I was doing it in a literally in a Gothic tower in the, if anyone's been to Newport, in the old armory downtown. And the room that I used was used by the Rhode Island Shakespeare Company to store all their props. So it was like sitting on Lear's
Sounds
throne. Your
very
skull is up.
inspirational.
Oh, it's
If you're going to write a book
it's
in 10 days, that's the place to do it.
yeah. So I did, and actually, it's weird. The Starbucks there where I started writing it, Tobias Buckell also started writing his first book
Oh,
at that
no kidding.
Starbucks. I want to send them a because there's some good science fiction mojo in that Starbucks.
Yeah, you should have like
But
an
yeah, so
official table there.
I know, right? Oh, that'd be so cool. So yeah, so I wrote it, and I knew it was really weird. I didn't really know how to write a book. So
Hmm.
like I used to get mad. I remember they'd said this on the first time I was on NPR, they said this about the book, and I was like, that's not true. It's not the case. It's totally true. They're like, well, it's basically like a 200-page poem. You're passing off poetry as prose. And I was like, nah, that's just silliness. I wrote a 200-page poem and took out the margins because I had no idea how to write a novel, and had no particular training in it. I've taken creative writing classes forever, but never once until graduate school did one of my creative writing teachers like do anything but tell me to quit. It took one teacher. Again, I guess I'm gonna like name check my good teachers here. So
Mm-hmm.
Kevin Clark,
Sure.
who is retired now, but he taught at Cal Poly. He was the first person to tell me, "You're ready to publish. You should be sending things out," and that was all it took. So I wasn't going to send it to anywhere in New York because I knew it was this odd experimental thing. I was rejected a bunch. I got a lot of "It's the most beautiful thing we've ever read, and we're definitely not publishing it" letters, which at 22 I was just like, what the fuck? I don't even know what
Mm.
that means. And then I was on LiveJournal, and this guy named Nick Mamatas, and he had just had his first book published, and I left a comment saying, hey, uh, I'm trying to find a
Mm-hmm.
publisher for my book, and I'm not asking you to like look at my pages or anything gross. I'm just saying, like, do you know small
Yeah.
publishers open? And he gave me a list, and I said, okay, well, they've all rejected me except for Prime Books, and they're closed to submissions. And he said, they're not closed. They just don't want to read slush. Like, send it to me. And if I like it, I'll send it on. And he did like it, and he did send it on. And I don't know, it was a couple months later, I was living in Japan, and I got an email from Jeff Vandermeer.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
yeah, yeah, saying, don't tell anyone, but they're gonna accept your book, and I want to write the introduction because I love it.
Had
Uh,
had had you known him, or did he just
Not
had
really.
been
He
passed to
was a
him
total
somehow?
cult level author. He'd written City of Saints and Mad Men, but like,
Mm-hmm.
he wasn't as known now after the movie as like back then in 2004 or 2003. And so he and his wife Anne sent me this box of like all of the cool writers who were writing experimental stuff, and said, welcome to the family.
Oh,
Like, it was
cool.
so
Yeah.
lovely. And I mean, I found out who he was immediately after that, and I love City of Saints and Mad Men. It's so good. um and we've been friends ever since, Anne and Jeff and
What do you
yeah.
I was going to say, what do you think about so you've kind of made you were waving your hand a little bit at your first book there, kind of like almost not dismissively because I can tell you have
I'm
an
not
affection for it obviously, but what do you think about that book now and just from a purely like, the standpoint of looking back through the lens of that's your first book, you're like, "Oh, I just deleted all the margins and I call it a novel and all that." What do you think about it now? What do you think about yourself when you published it? Like, tell us
It's
the.
exactly what I wanted to it is exactly what I wanted to write at the
Hmm.
time that I wrote it, without compromise and without concern for anything but executing what I wanted to write. And I am proud of that. And I am proud that it got published. You're right, I do dismiss it a little bit, because I'm well aware of what a difficult text it is. And I don't want to, I don't want people who like read Fairyland to feel like they need to go read that. Um, it's
But
I
just
don't want to say
because.
it's yeoman's work, but like that's part of what it
What?
is. Like I was learning.
Hmm.
It's like being a child star. I literally grew up as a writer in front of everybody because the first piece of fiction I ever wrote got published.
Right.
So
But just
I had to learn in front of out, no net.
so, but wait a minute. You said it's. I know it's difficult. Difficult doesn't mean it's not good. I
I
mean, don't you
don't say
think
it's
it's
not good.
good?
Probably. I don't know. I don't know. Honestly,
I
it's
can
20
see
years
your
ago, man.
PR,
I
the
barely
PR
remember.
execs at your publisher right now. Their heads just exploded. They're
It's
like, "What did she just say?"
part of it is that I don't really remember it very well. The
Hmm.
Orphan's Tales that you mentioned, I read that out loud during the pandemic, over Instagram. I read the whole thing. It's 1,000 pages. It's two big chunky
Mm.
books. And the first one I read every night, and the second one I read every like 3 nights. And I didn't remember hardly anything that was in that book.
Yeah.
Like, I write it down so I don't have to remember it. So part of it is I don't remember the Labyrinth all that well, but I do remember some of it. And like some of it does still feel to me like, I don't know. I was just so naked and passionate and
Hmm.
didn't give a shit. And I admire that about my
Yeah.
younger self. I really do. I give way more of a shit now. It's a huge pain. Like, don't give a shit. That's my that's my writing advice to everybody. But this is odd. Like, nobody's really ever has asked me about the Labyrinth in years. I I don't think it's a bad book. I just um it it just feels so distant. And what I was, I guess it's more what I was aiming for then is not what I aim for now.
Hmm.
I've gone through a lot of manifestos since then. And so it, to me, it's kind of a relic. It's a museum piece of who I was
But I would
when I was.
say, that's only natural. I mean, I think the idea of someone like I'm just trying to picture this in a very theoretical kind of way, but the idea of me picking up something like something I wrote, an interview I did, or whatever from 20 years ago and saying, "Yeah, that's damn good. That's perfect." To me, it's almost like, well, I must not have evolved at all or something. Like I kind of want to see, if anything, some sort of a change, like because it's all sort of perspective, like my perspective as I move through time.
I mean, like one of the just sort of amusing jokes, given what I do now, that we often make around this house is like the
Hmm.
idea that the girl who wrote that book also wrote space opera is patently absurd. Like the transition to what and wrote a Minecraft tie-in novel and
Right.
Mass Effect tie-in and all this other stuff that I've done. Like it's ridiculous. You'd never think the Labyrinth is the book of that girl in high school, that girl I very much was.
Right.
Uh and I write all kinds of different things now, so
Right. And I think
uh
I
but,
think
but
that
I can see your little teacher spidey sense there, that no one's ever called that. I do couch talking about the Labyrinth in all of this language, so that people won't think I expect it to be good, in case they don't like it if they when they read it, because they've read all my other stuff.
I
But
cannot imagine going through my life and looking at every single thing I've ever done and being perfectly happy and content with it. And I can't imagine any writer besides a writer that wants to be calculatedly, like sell every single book. Like a writer, I think a real writer is kind of honest,
Mhm.
and I think a real reader is kind of honest too. Like there's no reason why, I can watch different things and get different things out of them. And they exercise different muscles in my head. So even if I'm watching something or I'm reading something, I'm not going to say what it is, but I'm reading what I consider to be kind of a pulp novel right now, based on a major property. The author that wrote the original books passed away, and then there's someone else that's writing like other books in that universe. And
Mhm.
I can clearly see that the quality of the writing is not the same as the original author. However, that's not to say that it's bad, and it's also not to say that I'm not getting something out of it. It's also not to say that there's another, process going on in my brain. So I just think, it's important to
Yeah,
remember that, you know.
yeah.
Um, so I digress. I'm like looking down at the novel right now, and I'm like, I'm not gonna say. So uh, where was I? I wanted to know when this idea for a first draft, or I should say, when the idea for a novel kind of sparks in your head, and this is kind of related to what you're just talking about. How do you make the decision to like say, I'm going to pursue this. I'm going to go after it. Is there something where it just sticks and you can't get it out, or do you say that's a good idea? Let me work at this a bit. How do you approach?
Well, it's a little different now because I'm more established. So I have, contracts and deadlines and options, which are where various of my publishers have the right to look at my next project
Hmm.
before I show it to anyone else. So normally, if I get the feeling that an idea is worth pursuing, um, I will. It'll go in the next round of proposals.
Hmm.
So, once I finish, a set of books and have open contracts, then I'll do up some proposals, which is usually 3 chapters and an outline. And then we'll try to sell that. So boy, do I not remember the last time I wrote a book that wasn't already sold.
Hmm.
So it's once there's a certain, established name and stuff, you kind of get into that rhythm of a work life. So but there is a feeling that comes with an idea that is going to be a book. I've only put aside a few ideas, and maybe only two, three that actually had any real writing behind it.
Yeah.
Only one that's a finished book that's on my hard drive and not published. Um, so it's kind of complicated in that sense. But like, so The Past is Red started out as a short story. A few of my
Right.
novels have started out as short stories. I wrote the first line and I knew that I would want to do more with it. Like the character, which it's all first person, so it's her voice. You know, she just kind of appeared in my head fully formed,
Hmm.
and I knew I'd want to spend more time with her, but I didn't know what form that would take. And then my editor asked me to do a novella for her based on that. So you know, if he hadn't asked that, I probably would still in the back of my head be like, I'm going to write a Tetley novel one of these days. But it probably would be on the, you know, short stack of
Hmm.
proposals where the idea has survived, not thinking about it for a couple months and returning to it. Um, so there's that, and then there's a certain amount of serendipity that goes into it. My two most successful books, Fairyland and Space Opera, were both written having no intention of writing that particular book at that time at all. They both have very unusual publication stories. Um, got bumped up the sort of work queue out of order and written very quickly.
Hmm.
Um, I think that honestly, the common denominator between them, though I often joke it's that other people told me what to write, it's that I was just having fun without expectations on myself at
Hmm.
all with both of those books. And there is a certain quality that arises from that that you can't get anywhere else. And it's very hard to just have fun when it's your job. Uh,
Right. Right.
but like Space Opera was literally a Twitter dare. Uh,
Oh, that's how that
not
started.
even really a dare. Yeah, no, this is, I will tell you exactly how Space Opera got written. It's the dumbest story in publishing.
Oh, great.
So I was live tweeting Eurovision because I love Eurovision and have
Yes.
for years. Yep. And a fan of mine in the Philippines said, ha ha ha, you should write a science fiction or fantasy.
Bruh. Oh.
And I was like, ha ha, that'd be fun.
Yeah.
And I 5 minutes later got a DM from an editor at Simon and Schuster saying I will buy it right now. Uh, and which never happens,
That's
by the way.
ridiculous.
Let me like disabuse everyone's
Yeah.
expectations. Never happens. It's never happened to me before. I've never heard of it happening before.
Yeah.
My agent still calls it the fastest deal in publishing. The original contract still just says Eurovision in space. There's no
Right.
title. There's
Right.
nothing. Um, and so yeah, I had no intention particularly
So
of writing that.
it's this goofy concept, and you were saying that it felt like it freed you up to sort of like just
Oh yeah. I mean, you can't play Eurovision in space straight
right.
in any sense of the word. Like that's just that's such a goofy concept that it's going to have to be over the top and crazy. And so I wrote the first chapter of it. I literally have been working on the sequel all day, so it feels like a weird kind of time travel to be talking about the process of writing the first one. But I've wrote the first chapter very quickly and then kind of sat back and was like, this is super Douglas Adamsy. I mean, kind of is going to have to be if you have
Yeah.
British people in place. And I've lived in the UK
Mm.
and I haven't lived anywhere else that participates in Eurovision. Or at least I hadn't at the time. I have been in Australia quite a bit, but they weren't part of it at the time. And I just like, I felt comfortable writing about the people and the country that I have
Mm.
lived in, but not
Mm.
the other ones. So it's going to be Brits in space. And if you have Brits in space and like camp arch stuff, it's going to sound a little Adamsy. It just is. But I had to kind of make a decision as to am I mentally and emotionally prepared to be compared negatively to Douglas Adams? Because if I put this book out
He's a
as
tough
it,
guy to stand next to as far as
yeah.
yeah,
But in
I
some sense, that was kind of freeing too, because I was like, well, am I going to write the greatest science fiction comedy novel of all time? Not a chance. It's already been
so
done.
I'll just
But
go
I can
crazy
shoot for
and
the bronze.
yeah.
Like I can shoot for the bronze. And I'm very lucky that I have been compared a lot to Douglas Adams, and for the most part, it's been positively, which boy are young American women not allowed to get. But
Yeah.
it would so the even God, there was one review that like the comparisons were Pratchett, Adams, Vonnegut, and Wilde, and I was just like, well, I'm just gonna quit now because I
Wow,
can't even
yeah, just drop the
fathom
mic and walk away from it.
crazy. So I wrote this book in 5 weeks. That it was very hard, like to write comedy where the primary genre is comedy and the subgenre is science fiction rather than comedic scenes within a dramatic
Hmm.
work, which I'd done a lot. Um, but it was a totally new voice and a totally sort of new way to work for me.
Mm.
And it was, I mean, it's the structure of a sports movie, Like it's not complex at
Hmm.
all.
Hmm.
And there's a lot of Easter eggs in it for Eurovision. Like there's all these interstitial chapters that explain the history of a particular species or planet within the analog for Eurovision. And I've read reviews that people are like, I don't why those were in there. Because it's in Eurovision, because they do these things called postcards before each song where they explain to you the history of the country and the contest and everything. But so there's a lot of stuff like that. But I was able to kind of take the pyrotechnical writing that I do to make things metatextual and postmodern and use it to make things funny. And that was really interesting to me. It was completely 100% intellectually absorbing.
How much of that is, because like how much of that is like a calculated thing or a planned thing versus something that you write out and then you go back and look at it and you say, aha, that's what I was doing.
Um, it's mostly pretty deliberate.
Hmm.
There's a couple times where I've looked back and I've been like, "Oh, look how clever I was." But who knows if I just forgot? Might have just
Right,
forgot like what
right.
I meant to do.
Yes.
Um, there's when I was writing the Fairyland books, there was a moment where I looked back at one of the previous books and I was like, "Oh, I made myself a present. I like wrapped it up and shipped it to the next book. Good for me."
Right.
Uh, but but really, a lot of it's quite deliberate in the first place, particularly with space opera, because I'd never I'd never had to sort of consider the dimension of funny before. Like it's not just about the most mythically resonant word or the, prettiest one or the one that reveals character. You also have to find the funniest one. So like there's a
Yeah.
lot of it just takes a lot longer because you got to just sit there and come up with something that fits all the parameters and then decide what the funniest fruit or the funniest animal or like yeah, today I was going through 70s rock anthem song lyrics to find a name for a ship. Like
Right.
that takes a while.
Right.
So it takes longer. Comedy takes a lot longer for me to write than anything else. But it's all pretty deliberate. I can't think of anything I've looked back into space opera at, and I've looked back a lot, um, and have been like, oh, a cool thing. No, I remember painstakingly, laboriously pulling cool things into it. But that's not to say that there aren't things that just pop into your head. The whole scene with Clippy just popped
Hmm.
into my head, and I'm going to be getting Clippy gifts for the rest of my life. I have a Clippy fascinator. It's
Right.
gorgeous. I love it. But like, yeah, the biggest thing I learned was that like the dumber the joke, the more people like it. I was like, oh my god, that Clippy thing, people are going to hate it, and they all love it.
Yeah.
Well, either that or I just like my like there are moments where my sense of humor matches my reader's sense of humor in better ways than other moments. But yeah, it's all pretty deliberate. Um
So that kind of that sort of matches with a quote that I'd heard from you when you were describing some of like your early works. In that the thing that it sort of sticks out to me is that you said that you were writing language-oriented character studies, and to me, even though you didn't just sort of describe a character study necessarily with like space opera or whatever, what you did sort of talk about is like the precision behind and the deliberacy behind what you're doing. So how like can you describe to me what is it that's maybe compelling or what compels you to put the words on the page and to sort of choose your words and to build that setting and what are some of the things that sort of motivate you? Do you think there's still language oriented character studies maybe just applied in different ways or
yeah, I mean, I don't remember saying that, but I'm sure that I did. Like I
I
that, that's what happens when you've been doing this for 20 years. Like who knows? I do think that a, a lot of my work is still extremely grounded in character. God, the
mm-hmm.
past is red is. And Refrigerator Monologues, a lot of them are still very, very grounded in character. And I think some of that comes from my background in the theater. And it's the Refrigerator Monologues. Like they're designed to be read as monologues. They
Yeah.
are monologues.
Yeah.
Um, and I just, it's I want to what compels me wanting to get to a certain feeling or sense wanting to, you know, create a whole person. It's kind of the same impulse as having a kid. To pour all my love for something on the page. There's a number of my, I wrote the Glasstown game, which is all about the Brontes, which I was completely obsessed with for years and years, and just to make other people love what I love.
Mm-hmm.
But then I also get a real sense of pleasure from like a good alliteration or
Mm.
a good metaphor or a good joke. And I like there's there's a whole bit in the sequel to Space Opera that I am writing right now where it's like the informational brochures that humanity gets after encountering the fact that there are aliens out there, and just coming up with the names, the titles for those
Right.
uh, was so much fun. I'll tell you what my favorite one is because I remember that one. It was "Are you there, God? It's me, a dumb, useless baby species." you know and like if I can make myself laugh, then like I
Yeah.
know it's pretty good. And I love stand-up comedy. It's one of my favorite things in the world. So it's kind of like being both the audience and the stand-up at a show. But like any of those things can sort of motivate me to get it through. But I write from the beginning to the end, and I
Mm-hmm.
try really hard not to exactly know what the end is, because I have ADHD. If I know what the end is, my brain's like, and I'm
You
done.
want to jump to it.
I'm on break.
Yeah.
No, my brain will just quit. Like, I got to the end. I'm done. I'm out.
Mm.
We arrived. So I kind of try to conceal that from myself. So a lot of my motivation is simply to find out how it ends, the way a reader does.
Mm. And so you're writing. Actually, so it sounds like it's. I mean, it's just coming from you. Like essentially everything is coming from what you want to find out, what you want to like the satisfaction you get from maybe putting those words together in such a precise fashion. It makes you laugh or
Yeah.
cry or feel that feeling that maybe you're hoping will resonate with the reader. Um,
Yeah. I
so
mean, my deadlines matter too. People get mad if I don't work, but
yeah, that's another tough
but
thing. But I feel a
that's
little bit like you've mentioned a
very
few.
real.
I feel like you've mentioned a few times it's, and I don't know, I might be wrong. It sounds like you're a very fast writer. Is that fair to say?
I'm
Or
Yeah.
oh, that's impressive. That's like super impressive.
And part of sort of the recovery from having my son is just getting back up to speed, literally being able to write as fast as I used to. Yeah, no, I do. I wrote Space Opera in 5 weeks. I wrote Fairyland in 8 weeks. I wrote Palimpsest in 30 days. I used to write novels in 30 days a lot before I was diagnosed with ADHD, and I realized that I was just sort of outracing my hyperfocus. That like
Oh, so it was like a
that
very,
was there
without
was like a whole
knowing it, it
thing.
was like a coping mechanism to make
Yep,
sure you got it done so that because if it went past 30 days, you would jump to something else.
yep, yeah. So in a very real sense, I still kind of write that way. It just is longer than 30 days, but it's still best for me to keep it to 60,
Oh,
90 at top.
s-
Uh, like that's best for me mental health wise.
right,
But I do a lot of prep work before I even start writing as well. So it's not like I'm writing cold on day one. Like
right.
there will have been a lot of planning and prep
Like the
before
research that you were kind of talking
the
about, I would
research and
imagine.
the sort of character planning. And I get whenever I am sort of starting the planning process of a book, I get a big huge watercolor notebook, and I use that to take notes in so that I can, like, my writing can go in all kind of different directions and different colors and stuff like that. And then
So,
I just take a billion notes before I start writing anything.
do you have like a notebook that's kind of graphical then? Is that what you mean? Like you have like flow charts and you have like drawings here that and these are like the notes that you use
I mean,
maybe
I
to.
made them graphical. I don't get them pre-made, but like, yeah.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah,
Actually,
I mean, there's literally five of them sitting right over
do they look like this?
they're not nearly as neat as that, but
Oh,
they look
really? Oh,
kind of like that. Yeah.
yeah. Okay. Well, it's good to
But
know
yeah,
I'm not abnormal when I hear someone else doing it. At least I know it's not just me. Um, well, I wanted to switch gears here a little bit,
yeah.
and I wanted to talk about the term you coined that you laughed about in several interviews that you might not remember, and I wanted to talk about this a little bit. Mythpunk.
Yeah.
What is Mythpunk?
Oh,
I kind of have an idea, but I wanted to hear what you
Well,
had to say about it.
so like so many things, that was entirely accidental and
Yeah.
got away from me. And if you were to go back and look at the original blog post about it, it's a paragraph. It's
Yeah.
this little
Right.
thing. I've spent hours on blog posts and nobody
Yeah.
cares or remembers
Yes. Oh,
one
yes, they
paragraph.
do. Yes, they do.
Oh, they that people remember Mythpunk. So, the point I was trying to make was that at the time there were a lot of writers, sort of new writers coming up, or if not new, had only been at it for a couple of years, who were writing what I considered sort of thematically linked kind of stuff,
Hmm.
mythology, folklore, fairy tales, that kind of fantasy. But all of it was what I would consider punk, expressing a certain anxiety toward that myth, a certain anger towards it, desire to kind of tear it apart and rebuild it into something new. The safety pin earrings of literature. Uh, and so I said that if this were another era and we lived closer together, you'd call it a movement. And
Right.
then I kind of jokingly called it myth punk because at the time, slapping punk on something, it was just becoming uncool enough to make fun of. So it
Right.
really was genuinely a joke. Um, and people just like flipped their lid over it. Apparently, somebody who ran a role playing game already had that in use in their role playing game and literally emailed me and said, "You can have it. Yours is better." Uh,
Oh, that's
and
cool.
I know, very cool guy.
Yeah.
And yeah, so people kind of went nuts, and I think of it as something that like that belongs to people for whom they find that phrase meaningful. It's not for me to make a manifesto. Other people have.
Right.
I'm glad to have been helpful in coining it, and I do sort of, I will stick to my definition that
Mhm.
when you're basically using the techniques and tools of postmodernism in order to interrogate and rip up kind of the folkloric tradition and put it back together into something that is useful for those of us who live in the modern world.
Mm.
um, and that anxiety is what makes punk, as opposed to just a book about fairy tales.
Right.
uh, that unease with the traditional narratives that come out of those stories, and the desire to reshape them, um, without undue fawning and respect.
What do you think? So what was the impulse? I mean, I guess obviously you were just sort of doing it anyway, and then you just came up with a word to
Yeah.
describe it. And so it wasn't on that level, it wasn't a deliberate or conscious necessarily thing you were
I
doing. You
didn't
were
think that it would be anything but, tossed off a live journal entry one morning. Like
right,
had no notion. And I mean, again, like I can tell 1,000 stories that start with I had no notion it was ever going to be anything.
right,
Uh, and this is one of them. Like there's been myth punk conventions, like people have really taken it very much to heart, and I'm glad for that. That's awesome. Like, great, fantastic. There's a word that actually kind of describes what people like
right.
us do. That's wonderful. But I certainly did not. I mean, I've written manifestos. When I write a
Oh,
manifesto, you'll
oh,
know.
okay. We can just
There's no tension there of like defining a new movement. I was just kind of pointing out that there seemed to be something going on.
why do you think there is something going on? Like
I
in
mean,
in general,
that was
like
like 6, but
oh that I'm sorry.
that was like 2006 or 2000. I don't even think it was 2007.
But I sort of feel like from that idea, like there's this resurgence in the last, because I think back, and again, I think we're, like you mentioned, we're about the same, probably about the same generation. I may
Yeah.
be a little older there, but anyway, I remember like my sort of first encounters with like fantasy, myth, fairy tales, besides when I was a little kid and having them read to me, were like in my early teens when I started reading like, works by like like a lot of graphic novels and comic books, like the Vertigo titles from DC and all of that. And it seemed like this sort of thing that was a niche at the time, and then it sort of spread and became bigger and bigger and bigger, and it kind of has penetrated. I feel like it's everywhere sort of now. Do you think there's any particular reason why like the fantastical mixed with like our grounded reality has become so popular in recent years
Well,
or?
I mean, I think myth punk, if indeed such a thing truly exists, comes in cycles. My little cadre was certainly not the first ones to do it.
Hmm.
When you look back at Terry Windling and Ellen Datlow and Robin McKinley and the whole sort of border town crew, Ellen Kushner, there's all kinds of writers who were kind of doing this back in the day, and they were reinterpreting those tales for their generation,
Yeah,
and just that our generation was wildly different.
right.
So we were just treating it in a totally different way because our generation's concerns were totally different. And the lust for sort of retelling folklore and fairy tales, it really does come in cycles. Like it gets to a fever pitch, and then people are like, oh, too many fairy tales,
Right.
and it goes a couple years, then it comes right back with the next people who find use in retelling those stories. So, back then, I think that, God, it was such a different world back then. Like, I try to explain to people all the time that when I started out, we would have panels on diversity in science fiction and fantasy, and the panel was about whether it was a good idea or not. Like,
Right.
this wasn't that long ago.
Yeah.
And so it was a very kind of different place. So I think that we were coming out of the kind of lull in the cycle after, Windling and Datlow and McKinley and all of that had kind of had its peak.
Uh-huh.
And then, the 90s were less so about that, or the late 90s were less so about that. In the early 2000s, you kind of, late 90s, early 2000s, you kind of got some of the new weird coming along, and things kind of changing in that way. And then there's a burst of fairy tale and folklore and mythology retellings around that time, and then that kind of hit a peak and faded away, and then it started coming back. Like it really does come and go. And I think part of the reason the fantastic is everywhere is I mean, it's a confluence of a lot of things. One of it is the sort of the creation of that YA middle grade no man's land between children's and adult literature, and how popular that's become, how many movies have been made, and then Marvel becoming mainstream and virtually the only thing that can still make money in a movie theater has meant that simply speculative fiction is vastly more popular than it's ever been, and with less of a stigma. The cool kids can like comic books now, and so it's just a lot of stuff rolled up together. And I think that there's a lot more room now than when I started out for linguistic experimentation and structural experimentation within genre fiction. I think that's a much more open world than it was when I started out. I might like to think on my good days that I had something to do with it, but probably not. Who knows?
Of course you
Um,
did. What are you talking about?
well,
You're being modest
one,
now.
one always hopes. One hopes,
No,
but yeah, so all these things, they're just trends, and they come and they go. And every time a sort of new cadre generation cohort of writers come up, eventually one will always take a stab at fairy tales, and then that'll start a domino effect, and fairy tale we'll come up on it. It's gonna be like 5 years, fairy tales will be the hottest thing going again. um
yeah.
so yeah, it's cyclical like that.
Your description kind of reminds me of I remember reading an interview with Harlan Ellison like a very long time ago, and um, someone asked him, someone's he was talking about Stephen King, and he was saying Stephen King on a really good day is a great writer, but he's also got some schlocky stuff in there. And by the way, everybody, before you start sending me emails or complaining, like, I love Stephen King. I just like went up to have my picture taken in front of his house and all that. But he was saying, um, someone asked him, well, what do you think about all of the imitators that have come after him and sort of imitated him? And he said, no, 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 they're not imitators. What are you talking about? And they said, well, they're imitators because they're doing da 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 da. And he said, well, you may think that he is imitate or they are imitating him, but what he's really done is opened up a genre for like exploration, and he sort of created sort of a new kind of perspective of looking at things, and maybe people that are following after him are going to be called imitators, but they're not necessarily imitators. And I sort of feel like my roots, as far as fantasy goes, grounded in reality, like my roots will always be in those Vertigo comics, and because I hadn't
Mm.
really been reading much of that prose that way, I was reading comics. But to me, I sort of feel like I've tried to take that as a lesson, and I'm now look at it and I'm like, oh my goodness, we have all of these writers that are now freed up to express themselves in a language which they can also
Yeah.
customize and make their own and sort of talk about. And I think obviously, I mean, again, I think you're just being modest because even just on the most simplistic level, if you look at the fact that you've got 50 or 60,000 followers, what you've written obviously means something to a heck of a lot of people. So
Yeah.
I'm sorry, that was the teacher in me scolding you for not taking credit for what you've done. I'm like always trying to lift my students up, not hold them
Oh, I
down.
get it. I
Um,
get it.
so let me ask you this then. You've also mentioned about having like kind of like if you look back at your resume and all the stuff you've written, you're kind of all over the place. And I also one thing I noticed is that you've written, quote, books for kids or books for young adults and then books for adults. And how do you find it shifting between different types of writing?
I mean, I enjoy it and I'm okay with it. I can't really write two wildly different genres or age groups on the same day. Like, it's not great shifting from adult
Hmm.
straight into children's. There's going to be more f bombs than anyone's comfortable with.
Usually,
Uh,
yeah.
but so and if I go the other way, then the adult books get weird too. So I try to like work on one thing per day. But I really like doing lots of different you know, styles, genres, everything. My first short story collection was called Ventriloquism, and it's very deliberate because that's what I feel like I do in many ways. I throw my voice. And I'm always looking for the thing that um, I haven't done yet. And many times I've been asked what my favorite thing to write is, and the answer is the thing nobody thinks I would ever write. So and I've ended up writing wild stuff pursuing that. So I really like to change things up every time. It nearly killed me to write a 5-book series. Uh, but that's I'm lucky that I'm allowed to do that. And some of that was deliberate. After the Orphan's Tales did pretty well. Um, I insisted that the next book be not a fairy tale book
Hmm.
because I knew if I did one more in a row, I would
Hmm.
be the fairy tale girl forever.
Hmm.
So, Palimpsest comes between the Orphan's Tales and Deathless. But if Deathless had come out right after the Orphan's Tales, I don't think I would have been able to sell anything but fantasy and
But
fairy
that's
tales.
sort of
Um, but by picking a pretty different project every time, there's a trade-off because you can sometimes make more money if you're willing to do the same thing over and over again. But the trade-off is the freedom to do whatever I want to do. And
right.
my editors are pretty supportive at this point of knowing that even if it sounds way out of my comfort zone, I can pull it off.
You mentioned the freedom to do what you want to do. Is that one of the reasons why this was a real thing that like I was super interested in? You crowdfunded one of your books. I was like, holy cow, what an interesting idea. What was it that prompted you to crowdfund? So it was your first Fairyland. It was the girl who circumnavigated Fairyland in a ship
Yeah,
of her own.
making.
Okay, yes. I'm so sorry. Oh my goodness.
No, 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 no. It's a
What
long freaking
I
title.
was trying to remember. So I do this. I
It's long.
partially have notes, then I want to also do it on the off the
No,
cuff and all
man,
that.
I get bored halfway through writing that title out. I'm like, oh, it's still going.
Like
Uh,
how
but
what prompted you to crowdfund? Why were
I
you
couldn't make the rent. That's what motivated.
Oh.
So, the girl who circumnavigated Fairyland appears for the first time in a book called Palimpsest, which is a very adult book. It is a adult with a capital A and three X's. It
Mhm.
is
Mhm.
not for kids. One mom had me sign a copy for her daughter because she loves Fairyland, and I literally wrote like,
Ooh.
Annalisa, for when you're older.
Yeah.
Uh, please don't read this now.
Yeah.
No one get in trouble. But so it's the favorite novel of or favorite book of the novel's protagonist. And she read it when she was a little girl, and it's just a little, that happens in postmodernism. We do stuff like that, book within a book. But the economy crashed, and my publisher ceased to exist. And my publisher was Bantam Spectra, and it was reorganized into Random House, and suddenly no one was
That's
there anymore.
shocking. Okay.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, like this is what happens. It's called Black Wednesday in publishing. Um, so that happened 6 weeks before my book came out, which is your publicity window. So we knew that it, it was either give up on this book and maybe give up on writing, because the second Orphan's Tales book didn't do as well. So we kind of knew that this might be our last shot at New York.
Hmm.
Um, and it was either make this book a success or give up. So my now ex-husband and I, he was working remote, and we got in a car with one of my best friends, SJ Tucker, who'd done an album based on the book, and we sold that book out of the back of her truck from Maine to LA for 4 months. And we did reading concerts where I would read and she would sing. They were full costume. We would
Hmm.
pick up performers every city we were in. We we did our show everywhere, from like a beautiful hotel to a sports bar. Like we did it everywhere. And it was a medium success, but
Hmm.
then it was the first time I was nominated for a Hugo
Yeah, I
as
was going to
well.
say that's a pretty
Yeah.
good result out of all of
Yeah,
that.
it was. And then when we came back, my ex-husband was fired from 2 jobs within 6 weeks of each other, and we didn't have money for groceries or rent.
Hmm.
And I was like, "Okay, well, I mean, I can go back to grad school, but it's gonna be a minute,
Yeah.
before, like, that shows any dividends." So I figured I'll do a serial novel online. And this was, man, Kindle really had just started. Kickstarter had
Yeah.
I'm not sure Kickstarter had started. Like,
Yeah.
all of
I'm
this
not sure. Yeah.
brand new. Word crowdfunding was brand new.
Mm.
This is 2000, early 2009. And so I thought, well, what can I write that isn't going to cost me a publishing contract
Yeah.
down the road, if I give this away for free, because nobody might donate anything to it. And a friend of mine named Amal El Motar, who's a wonderful writer, said, I was t- chatting with her, and I said, maybe I could do Fairyland. Everyone wants to read Fairyland, because everywhere we'd gone on the tour, people have been like, where can I get that book? That book sounds awesome. Where can I get a copy? And I'd be like, doesn't exist, never gonna exist, not a real thing. And she was like, yes, please write Fairyland. So I put a chapter on my website every Monday. I
Mm.
recorded myself reading it. Um, and I just put a donation button. It said, donate whatever you think the book is worth. If you can't afford it, that's fine. Um, go with God.
Yeah.
Uh,
And
but
that was the one that Neil Gaiman found that, right? Was that
yeah,
the and
um,
he was like I wanted to say he retweeted it. But no, that's not it.
he
He blasted it. What is that called? He
like he put it on blast. I don't know.
yeah, something like that.
Yeah, he put it there, and so did Cory Doctorow, and a bunch of other people, and it went viral within 24 hours. Um, it was amazing. It was amazing, and it was a like people have asked me a lot of times. This was 10 years ago exactly, basically from when the book came out to this year. There's going to be a box set 10th anniversary edition. But like people would ask me all the time, like how I did it, how I had such a successful crowdfunding campaign. And I'm like, I don't think I could do it again. It was
Mm.
just this perfect storm of people wanting to help somebody, and me having a pretty good reputation after 7 adult novels. So people had never had anything they could share with their kids before. And the quality of the story, and the people picked it up, and it really was magical. It genuinely was magic. And I remember going to a convention like a week after it started, and somebody asked me in the audience, they're like, you can't go back and change anything because you're just posting it online. I went, oh fuck. It just never occurred to me, like, I
I
can't.
don't know about that. I
Like,
would not. Frank Herbert changed his because he originally published Dune in a magazine, like a monthly magazine, and I was so and I it never occurred to me until a few years ago to go back and then he got Dune eventually published by Chilton, the mechanics publisher that publishes like manuals for like disassembling your carburetor. And I thought, wait a minute,
know
I
that.
want to see if if it's the same as what he published. And I went back. It's a little different. He made quite a few changes. You could
Well,
potentially.
but at the time, I didn't think it was going to get published. So the
Oh,
only publication it was ever going to get was online.
right.
And what I said at the time was like, well, comic book writers have been doing it for a long time. I'm sure I'll figure it out.
Mm.
And I did write a couple weeks ahead of what was posting,
Yeah.
but um, so we started posting it. I started posting it in May, and in October we sold it to Fywell and Friends, and then it won the Nebula,
Yeah.
the Andre Norton Award
Nothing to
for
sneeze at.
no, and the first, as far as we could tell, the first self-published book to win a major literary award of any genre
Yeah.
before it was published. Um, and then the next year, it debuted at number 8 on the New York Times list. Like genuinely, Fairyland is this little engine of magic in my
Yeah,
life.
that's wonderful. You mentioned you mentioned comics, and I wanted to ask you about the Refrigerator Monologues. What prompted, like, what sparked that idea? I love the idea of you kind of examining like several different tales, several different stories, and kind of like taking a look at each one and sort of and the fact that oh my goodness, I feel really bad here. I've forgotten the name of the artist. The drawings that she did in it were,
Anywho,
yeah, really fabulous. What sparked this idea and how did you go about writing it?
well, I saw The Amazing Spider-Man 2, and I was
Oh,
very mad about it. Not because I didn't know Gwen Stacy
yeah.
died. Like even when I was telling my editor this story, he's like, "But you knew that Gwen Stacy died." I'm like, "Yeah, I'm not an idiot. Like I read comics. I know Gwen Stacy dies." Everything about that movie looks like they're not going to do it in this movie.
Mm.
That they'll push that to another movie, and so I kind of was just like, whatever. And also that series had nothing really going for it besides the chemistry between Emma Stone and Andrew Garfield. So I felt like they'll do that in the third movie of the trilogy. That makes sense
Right.
narratively. That makes sense, box office wise. It'll be fine. And like the last goddamn thing she says is, "I can take care of myself," and then she flounces off, literally flounces
Yeah.
off, and gets herself killed. Uh, so I was furious about it. The stupid movie made me cry. I didn't want to cry, and I certainly didn't want to cry about Gwen Stacy. And I was angry at it for making me upset because I just had to watch it all happen again. Just yet another
Yeah.
woman
Right.
who exists to be killed. And we were complaining. My husband and I were complaining about the movie, and I said, I'm going to write something about this, and it's going to be called the Refrigerator Monologues. It'll be the vagina monologues for
Mm-hmm.
superheroes girlfriend.
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, "Well, but you can't. I mean, you can't because you don't own Gwen Stacy." And I'm like, "It's fine." I had literally said this at a Baltimore Cuban restaurant. I said, "I will create an analog DC Marvel crossover universe
Yeah.
where people who have read it will get what I'm
Yeah.
talking about, and people who haven't, it will just seem like its own superhero story. No problem." He was like, "No problem." I was like, "Yeah, it's fine. Yes, I will just recreate the whole
I
history of American comics."
I would like to say I would have supported you in that because I feel like that is I think it's a great idea. I love that you did it, and there you go blowing stuff up again. Like
Yeah,
I think that's refrigerator punk maybe is what you've just
yeah, yeah,
invented with
comic
that.
book.
What was it like getting into the heads of
Oh,
those women and finally like sort of telling their
I loved writing that.
sides of it?
My girls, like that book, when I finished writing it, I felt like I had graduated from high school,
Hmm.
not in the sense of like accomplishing something amazing, but in the sense of like, yeah, maybe you'll see your friends again, but it'll never be quite the same as it was when you were together in this
Right.
moment with girls. Um, I probably spent longer trying to find 40-ish superhero names that hadn't been used before and
Right.
it took like the entire book because that took forever. It took forever because you can come up with one, but then you got to deep Google to make sure that Marvel
Yes.
doesn't own that,
Right.
you
Right.
know. So I had to come up with all those freaking names, and then I had all these rules that I set out for myself as far as the regular names, like Samantha Dane and Paige Embry and all that. Like they had to be the same syllable number, like the same
Right.
metered syllable numbers as the
Yeah.
original.
Yeah.
Nobody gives a crap but me, but I cared.
Yeah.
Uh, and then like I would like I really loved writing it. I really did. Uh, just getting straight into their headspace. And then I loved writing the Dead Town parts as well, and
Hmm.
just doing these kind of sketches of what an underworld might look like between the various chapters. And my, honestly, my favorite is not usually what other people call out as their favorite, even though I'm like, it's obviously the best one, but others do not agree. So the Karen Page one, which is
Hmm.
called, it's Daisy Green, Daisy Green Says I Love You, is the name of the section. And it's because God knows, too many of them in comics are. It's the woman's a radio talk show host. I don't know what the deal was, but like God, there were a lot of those in comics in the 80s. And I had this voice in my head while I was writing it. It's from a video game called Vampire Bloodlines that I love, and it's the radio talk show host in that, Deb of Night. And you can hear that voice now too, because we got Deb of Night to read the audiobook. So literally the voice I had in my head
Yeah.
while I was writing the book, we found the actress, and my husband, couldn't sleep. He's like, I'm gonna find out who Deb Knight is and see if she'll do an audiobook. And her name's Karis Campbell. Some people may know her from the West Wing. And she did the audiobook. And so Deb of Night, like the
That's
actual voice in my
awesome.
head, reads Daisy.
That's
Yeah.
yeah.
But
So
it's very special. I don't think I'll ever repeat that sort of experience as a writer, being able to hear the voice in my head out loud.
well, I think
But it's very much like you're telling a fairy tale. Like it's the same kind of process.
mm,
Superheroes are fairy tales. They are our fairy tales for the modern world. Um, and I love those girls to pieces.
yeah, and I was gonna say I just as a I think again like the teacher in me is just really happy to see. I don't want to use the term calling out, and I don't want to say that I don't want to use the term deconstruction, but I just want to I think it's really important when we take a look at tropes and things like that because they're reflections of what's going on in our own I think on like a cultural level or a societal level and you can kind of hold usually they're I think our fiction and all of that is like basically kind of a mirror for what's going on in our own realities, like to me. And I think it's really important that someone actually I know that the term had been used before and I know that, it had, people knew about this idea, but the idea of actually what you
Yeah, I don't want to say it's not my idea. It's Gail Simone's idea,
yeah,
and was books dedicated to her. There's a gargoyle named after her. Like I'm very conscious of the particular giant upon whose shoulders I stood.
and she's got a great Twitter feed as well, and you
Yes, she
should all go
does.
check it out. Um, but what's interesting to me though is I also wanted to talk about, and the thing, so there were a couple things that attracted me to you, and I wanted to get you on the program for this. Was one I wanted to ask you about that. The other thing I wanted to ask you about was an interview I read. So I'm a big role player, and until now we haven't even said a word about role playing. But that's okay because I'm totally fine with that. You were talking about all the tropes of role playing and how like there are it's very role playing is kind of forgiving of tropes in some ways, but it's
Yeah.
also like to me anyway, that means if something's forgiving of it, it can also sort of reinforce them. I wanted to know like before we even talk about that, when did you start role playing?
I guess the first time I was like, my first time, I was 19, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, you do have to have some level of friends to do role playing games,
It's
and I didn't even have that level of friends until
oh,
later in my life.
okay.
And so when I sort of did have friends in junior high, I graduated early from high school. So when I sort of did had friends, we were all in theater together. So like that was our role playing, and nobody I knew. I think I'd vaguely heard of Dungeons and Dragons, but nobody I knew played it. It was only when I went to college that I met people that played it with the grid paper, like old school, and everything. And I quite liked it. I ended up much later. Well, not I guess not that much later. I was only like 26. I was in a Planescape campaign for 2 years, So that was really cool.
That's kind of
Uh,
hardcore. Like a lot of people are like they don't even know what
yeah,
Planescape maybe
I
is, but
know, right? That's a deep cut.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, and I've played on and off in various. It's always so hard to get a DM, man. Like that's
That's
always
that's the
the rough
trope
part. And getting
of
adult,
role playing, actually.
yeah.
Yeah. And
I just like last week ran a one shot campaign for my niece and my
I
nephew though.
saw that. I saw that in your Twitter feed because I stalk all of my guests because I want to kind of like know what's going on. And that's related to a question I wanted to ask you a little bit
Yeah.
later. But that's cool that you're running for other people. I think that's an awesome like thing.
I wouldn't do it for just anyone, but they're 13 and 9, which are tough ages in their own unique ways. And I thought that it would be really good for both of them in different ways if they liked it,
Mm.
that it might provide something cool. And I told them that if they liked it, I would do a monthly Zoom.
Oh,
We'd do
cool.
a big camp. And so we will. We're gonna start around Halloween. And they did really like it. But it was funny when my sister-in-law, their mother, kind of noticed how much work it is.
Mm.
Because like I went and got a pre-rolled campaign off the internet, but it wasn't
Yeah.
good enough. So I rewrote the whole thing. And she was like, to my niece and nephew, like, she just spent 5 hours writing this for you guys.
It takes a
Like,
long
it takes
time.
a long time. And I wrote all the riddles and like
Okay,
everything.
I'm going to say this. I'm going to say screw it. I'm just going to ask you that question right now because I remember when I read the interview, and the thing that sticks out in my mind is when they asked you if you wanted to, being obviously a writer, a creator, a spinner of yarns, and a poet and a
Yeah.
teller of tall tales and all that stuff. They asked you if you kind of want to run a game, and you said, "Nah, I don't think I can see myself putting." And I'm paraphrasing here. This is not exactly what you said. I don't think I can see myself putting so much time and energy into something when I could apply it towards writing a book.
Yep.
So what was it besides like seeing the little doughy eyes of those young children expecting a wonder to be transported in, somewhere else?
It's
What?
cute that you think that was the expression
Oh,
and
that
not
wasn't it.
total dubiousness. They'd never even heard of Dungeons and Dragons. They'd never.
Oh.
So they had no idea what to expect. I just love my niece and nephew. I wanted to do it for them, and I
Mm.
thought it would be good for them. I wouldn't like. Ooh, I cannot imagine what it would take for me to do that for just like random
Right.
people.
Right.
It's just a lot. It's a lot of what I do normally.
Yeah.
Um, but the nice thing about kids is that they don't know about tropes. So
Yes.
like,
I agree.
they don't care if that riddle's been used before, and they don't care if I just like, well, I mean, they were delighted with a beholder because they've never heard of a
Right.
beholder.
Right.
But then I still had to do the work of nerfing it because they're just kids. They
Yeah.
can't like, and they're level 3. They're not going to do much against an actual beholder.
Right.
So
You
I
don't
had to get
actually want
cool,
to kill
I had
all
to
of
get
their
cool enemies
characters and
and then knock them down so that they were actually dealable in any way. Uh, and I just wanted to do it for them. And part of the reason that I kind of wanted to do it for them is that as kids, and I'm their auntie, so I'll never be that cool. Like, the, they didn't sit down. Oh, this is gonna sound arrogant, but they didn't sit down to it like, oh, Kat Valente is gonna tell us a story. It was Auntie Cat is
right.
gonna do a game. Like, that's a different thing,
Right.
a different situation than almost anyone else I would run a game for.
So then, okay, so it's interesting that you say that, and I don't think it sounds like, egotistical or conceited or anything at all. I can completely imagine the idea of like, there are people that come to you with certain expectations and they're like, "Oh my gosh, she's I want her to run the game for me," or like
Yeah,
she does this, she does that. And then there's also friendships or people that you want to spend your time with, and it's a two-way street as opposed to one person or one group of people feeling more and trying to maybe pull more
yeah.
out of you. um what sort of so you had mentioned, I guess, that you were playing in a lot of games because you didn't want to necessarily apply so much energy and time toward creating
But I
worlds.
really enjoy playing, and
I
I enjoy the creativity and all of that that goes with playing. I just didn't want to spend hours and hours designing
Right.
everything.
What sort of a character or characters have you played, and what
Oh,
is?
um, I played in the Planescape campaign. I played a light elemental, and then a tiefling, half tiefling, and oh God, I was thinking about we did a campaign with two of my really good friends, and I'm like, what the hell did I play? I just remember helping them design their
Right.
characters. Uh, and I was so proud of myself for coming up with a good name for my friend's character, because she wanted to be like a plague doctor.
Hmm.
And I was like, cool, cool, cool. We always need healers. That's fine. And she's like, yeah, I can't think of a good name though. And it was like 3, 2, 1. It was like, you're Yersinia,
And you just that's it. That's the
right?
Catherynne Valente
It's,
magic. It just
I
happens.
know, but like, it does sometimes.
That's
And
great.
I know a lot about the plague. So yeah, so I think I was a furbolg.
Oh, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I was.
And so
I know I had a pangolin familiar that I could throw like a big rock in battle. But I don't remember. Yeah, I was in Moonwort. I was this like big gnarly giant furbolg thing. So yeah, I never ever play human. Fuck humans. Nope, never
hmm
ever.
hmm
Sorry if I'm not supposed to be swearing.
That's all right. You're the
No.
guest.
I always my game style in like Magic the Gathering, in D&D, and all of them is I want to do magic at it till it explodes.
Hmm.
So though I like weapons, I will always trade them for having cool magic spells. So I'm usually playing some kind of magic user. And then it's just sort of what I'm feeling that day, as far as the day that I roll the character up,
Right.
as far as what particular mythical beast I want to be. But I'm usually looking for something weird. Oh, and I played a Kenku.
Oh, cool. They are kind of cool. What
Yeah.
what are you looking for like when you're playing? Are you just looking for the fun? Are you just looking to blow off steam? Is your or like how does your group maybe approach it? Are you actually like looking to build a narrative? Are you just trying to laugh? Is it some combination of all of
I mean, it
that?
has a lot to do with DM. My husband's DM'd for us many times, and usually there's kind of a sort of mystery element to it, and there's good comedy, and then the fighting. But I don't know, I enjoy everything about it. I like the feeling of throwing dice. I like the creative problem solving.
Hmm.
You know, trying not to go like completely for the obvious, just like put the pointy end in. Um, and I do enjoy a world where basically anything goes as long as you can sell it.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know.
To the other viewers
uh,
or participants.
and it allowed me to kind of yeah, yeah, well, to the DM.
Right. That's true too, right? Because if the DM doesn't buy it, then you're not going to be able to do it. This
Yeah,
is I
yeah,
wrote
yeah.
this so
But
for
like, I mean, my nephew insisted on playing a twiddle toad,
oh,
which is
sounds like
not even really a thing to
yeah.
play at
That's
all.
that's all right because I would constantly because I run games often for like so I've taught elementary through high school through college, and what's funny is I found that the younger the kids are, the more often they are, or the more likely they are to just say sort of say I want to do whatever I want to do, and they come up with all kinds of like cool schemes and ideas to run with. Um, I this question and I send questions to all of my guests beforehand and just because I don't want them to feel like they're going into something like totally clueless or whatever. But this question's going to sound like awfully just simplistic, and maybe it is, and I don't even know it. But like, what are like the differences that you've experienced between like a work of fiction and maybe a role-playing session? Like I understand obviously like a role-playing session is live, you just sort of do it once, it's not recorded or anything usually and it just sort of happens. But like
Yeah, it's
when you're
got that ephemerality of theater.
yeah, like when you're making up stories together around a table, how does it strike you as being different from when you're actually sitting down focused on writing something that other people are going to read?
Well, I mean, so there's a certain amount of like subtlety and B plots you're not going to bring in, because people just won't remember it from session
Hmm.
to session. if you've got a ton of, I mean, there are probably groups that do, and don't have professional podcasts about it, but like it's pretty hard in a modern where everyone's working world, to meet once a month and remember everything that happened before. So you're not going to have, necessarily the smoothest of dialogues and motifs and leitmotifs and all that kind of stuff. So that's certainly a difference. It totally depends on the quality of your group, how much people will be in character or
Yeah,
not.
yeah.
And some days I'm in the mood to totally be in character with people, and some days I'm, just want to like drink beer and
Right,
do magic.
right,
Uh, so that there's a difference there too. I think that from a DM's perspective, like there's a real immediacy. Like, if there's going to be a joke, it needs to land now,
right.
not when you've thought about it for 15 seconds.
Yeah,
If you want to strike awe with a monster, that needs to hit. That need not just be like, oh, I guess that's kind of cool. So there's kind of a playing to the audience, and when I was running it for my niece and nephew, it was, a lot of on the fly kind of changing things up to incorporate the fact that people act like idiots. And that's one of the things I love about role playing, because you would never have people in a story act as dumb as
right.
people do in an actual scenario, and they're not trying to be dumb,
Yes,
they're trying to be creative. But when you made this story for them and you would like to proceed them through it, and they like, it's been 25 minutes and they literally haven't read the mysterious writing on the wall,
right,
uh like it's like the old webcomic with all the Lord of the Rings stills, and going through it as a DM whose party will just not stay on task. But as soon as you get more than two players, they will not stay on task and they
right.
will not do what you expect them to do. And that sort of dynamic kind of atmosphere is super fun. I genuinely love how bullheaded and dumb parties are when going about this nicely arranged quest. And I love seeing what people, including myself, will come up with that has nothing to do with the rails that we're supposed to be on.
Right. Yeah, I kind of I really enjoy that too. Like I enjoy the challenge. Like I try to sort of there's this kind of balance that I try to strike when I'm running a game between, that reality, but then there's that fantasy. There's a level of I feel like the low-hanging fruit is to go for comedy because it's really easy
Mhm.
to just look at the situation of like five adults sitting around a table throwing dice and pretending to talk in voices and things like that. But I try to sort of stretch it and see how far I can push it in other directions in order to like just see what like I can do with it. But it's interesting that you mention um, that idea of the fun of it, and I think no
Yeah.
matter what, and the fun of doing something stupid or doing something ridiculous, and how that can kind of like bring out or maybe add something memorable to a session that might not otherwise be. Um,
Yeah. I mean, not to just give examples from this one I just ran, but it does come to mind. She won't mind me telling. My sister-in-law played as well, and so my nephew is a twiddle toad,
mhm.
and they come to a mysterious hole in the wall with mysterious writing, and instead of reading it, my sister-in-law is like, "Put the toad in the hole." Now he would have died, just died. I had nothing planned for that kind of thing. I just gave her a look like, "Oh my god, could you not?" Because he, like, I promised no one would die.
Right.
Like, before we played, I was like, "You cannot lose this. Don't worry about being, silly or being made a fool of. It's not going to be like that. I will not let any one of the characters die."
Yeah.
So I promised that no one would die, and then she's literally just going to shove him into a thing that's going to cut him in half. Fortunately, they ultimately decided not to put him in the hole, but
Right.
it's that kind of thing. Like, if I'm writing a story, in as much as we talk about characters do their own thing, yeah, no character of mine is ever gonna like cram a toad in a hole, like,
Right.
to see what happens, just to see what happens without
Yes.
putting a stick in there or
Yes.
anything first. Like, no character of mine would ever do that. So like the things like that are just totally unpredictable from a storyteller's perspective are fantastic. It's just gold. And I will remind her of that for the rest of our lives together.
Does it, I guess it keeps you on your toes, maybe as like the creative side of you to sort of fit things together in order to work. So if you've made a bargain with them in which you're not going to kill them, you have to sort of deliver that non-killing. But then on the other hand, you
Mhm.
also have to sort of stay true to the bounds of the story and maybe not totally break their suspension of disbelief, even though they're playing an RPG, I guess.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I don't really know what I would have done if they like
right.
I probably would have attacked them with something. I don't know before they could do it. But like I'm not entirely sure. I was not prepared for the adult in the room to
Right.
have the craziest idea.
Right. Well, let me ask you. I know that I've kept you a little bit longer than I told you it was going to be. So if you don't mind, I think I'll
Yes.
ask you one final question here. Um, what do you see as maybe the value in role playing, maybe in general, if there is a value? If how do you think that maybe it could actually make a difference, if at all?
Well, first of all, it's about the most accessible theater that anybody can have. It is just group improv theater. You know, you're being given prompts by a DM and you are acting them out and creating a scene, and it's improv, it's theater. And you're way more likely to get your friends to play D&D than you are to get them to show up at your house to do improv.
Right.
Uh, and theater and all of those things that go with it are inherently bonding to human beings, creating something together. It's also cheaper than any theater ticket is going to be for some time, if ever. And it allows you to explore moments and tropes and relationships and characters and settings that you just wouldn't get to have that immediacy with otherwise. um one of the things about video games that makes video game writing different than a lot of other writing is that the player is always implicated in what happens in the game, even if there is no real choice for the player, where
Yeah.
the same thing's going to happen no matter what. The player feels like they chose it.
Right.
And the same thing with role playing, that you can actually get very confrontational if you want to with, people's preconceived notions and prejudices and everything with a role playing game. And it feels safe because there's rules and we have all this dice and we have this paper and things have numerical values. Um, but you can really get into it with people, and it can be a really deep and moving experience that feels implicatory, and not just that, but feels personal. It feels like it happened to you, which is what great theater is. But it's very hard to be in New York every night to
Right.
go see a theater show.
Right.
It's actually a lot easier, and it's not very easy to get a group of people together for a role playing game. It's a pretty unique form of entertainment, and on top of that, for younger people, I think that it really can help with math and numbers, and put a fun face on some of the less fun memorization that comes with school. I think it's just pretty awesome.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned the fact that it's a memorable sort of experience. I mean, what's interesting to me is that things like books, even movies, or obviously maybe acting it out. What's interesting is that people have done studies where they've taken a look at like the areas of the brain that are kind of like highlighted and like fire off when these things are happening, and they found that the same and I'm not a biologist, I'm not a scientist, but in general, from what I gathered from reading, the same things are occurring in your brain that would be occurring with someone in where they were actually experiencing those things.
Mhm.
So if they're reading about an adventure of one of your characters, or if they're actually, pretending to go on the adventure themselves in a role-playing game, then the same sort of connections are being made in their brain that would otherwise be made in real life. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, well, remember I said I played a light elemental and then a half tiefling. It's because about a year and a half into this 2-year campaign, my light elemental sacrificed herself to save the whole group, and like it was a big night, and we all cried, and it was very moving. Like, yeah, it was I planned it with the DM long in advance,
mhm.
but like it was a very Avengers Endgamey kind of moment, and you know, God, that was years and years and years ago. A character that never existed, it's never been put down on paper, never will. And I still remember her, and I still remember what happened to her and the choices we made and everything. Like, it's a really powerful thing.
Yeah. Well, Catherynne, thank you so much. You have stayed longer than I asked you. I really
Okay.
appreciate that, and I apologize for taking you a little bit
Oh
longer.
God, don't worry about it.
So, for those of you watching at home, I just want you to know that I pick my guests based on people that I find to be interesting, and I'm not doing this for any other reason. I'm not being paid, obviously, for any of this. From the interviews and articles and the things of Catherine's that I've read, I've found them all to be really interesting, and I highly recommend. I mean, you can kind of tell that if you've been listening to this whole conversation. She's been running introspective loops around me the whole time. Her writing is a real pleasure and a joy to experience. So I highly recommend you go. Her newest book is the Past is Red. It's, as she said, it was based on a future. No, it was based on a short story called The Future is Blue, I think. I highly recommend that you go out and check it out. And Catherine, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on the program, and I look forward to
Definitely.
your work in the future. All right,
Thank
everybody,
you so much. Bye, everyone.
have a very good night.